Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this special J-Talks Live event for Media Literacy Week. Media Myths Debunked, what the public doesn't know and needs to know about journalism and why it matters. Thank you for joining us. While our gathering today is virtual, the CJF office is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and we are privileged to live and work in these territories. The CJF is grateful to our exclusive J-Talk series sponsor, TD Bank Group, for making this conversation possible. Our thanks also extend to our in-kind supporter, Cision, and to CPAC, our broadcast partner for these events. You can learn more about our full season of J-Talks Live on our website and by following us on social media. Our next event, Will Games Save Journalism, will level up the conversation as our global panel of games editors and experts explore the Wordle to newsreader pipeline. A reminder that our talk today is an hour long, and you can submit questions for our speakers anytime using the tab on your screen. Recent polls paint a concerning picture of trust in the media. In the US, Gallup reports only 31% of Americans have a great deal or fair amount of trust in media, with more expressing no trust at all. In Canada, the situation is equally troubling. The Reuters Institute Digital News Report shows a 39% trust score, down nearly 20 percentage points since 2018. In response to these challenges, the CJF has launched Trust Wisely, our latest national campaign empowering Canadians to make informed choices about their news sources. With this campaign, we wanted to acknowledge the power of public trust in a time of widespread digital misinformation. By sharing simple tips and tools, we're using Media Literacy Week as a platform to get the public to think differently about how they spend their trust in today's media landscape. The initiative helps Canadians recognize and support journalism worthy of their trust. Watch how we tell this story. Building trust requires transparency and accountability. Public editors, standards editors, news ombuds, or readers editors serve as essential bridges between newsrooms and their audiences. Today's panelists have extensive experience in this area, and we are thrilled to have them here today to help debunk the myths and misconceptions they encounter in their roles. Joining us from here in Toronto, Sandra Martin is the Globe and Mail's standards editor. Also in Toronto, Jack Nagler is CBC Ombudsman. And joining us from London, we're delighted to have Elisabeth Ribbans with us. She is the Guardian and Observer's Global Readers Editor. And here in Toronto, welcome Donovan Vincent. He is the Toronto Star's Public Editor. Leading our discussion today is Kathy English, a veteran journalist, and she was the longest serving public editor of the Toronto Star. Since 2020, Kathy has brought her wisdom and experience to her role as chair of the CJF board, continuing to strengthen and guide our work. Kathy, over to you, and a warm CJF welcome to this extraordinary panel.
Thank you, Natalie, and a warm welcome to our audience as well across Canada and beyond. Thank you to this distinguished panel of journalists who do what has long been described as one of the most difficult jobs of journalism in upholding both the editorial standards of their news organizations and serving as an intermediary to the public. Whatever the title, whether it be public editor, ombudsman, standards editor, or readers editor, this role is at heart about accountability. Accountability to news audiences and accountability to journalism's highest standards. Having done this job, I well know that those in this role have a front row seat to the public's questions, concerns, and criticisms of journalism. And I also know that they play a key role in the foundations of media literacy, which is really all about helping to create a greater public understanding of quality journalism and why it matters. In doing this job, we also get a really strong sense of the ongoing misunderstandings about journalism and its standards, which would lead me to my first question. I'd like each of you to tell me, from your perspective in your role within your own news organization, what's one thing the public does not understand about journalism? So we'll start with Sandra, go to Jack, then Elisabeth, then Donovan. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Kathy. Well, I am passionate about corrections. It probably takes up the largest part of most of my days, but not every journalist shares my admiration and love for corrections. They're a bit misunderstood. So getting ahead of myself, I mean, you've probably heard, and people who are listening, the saying that newspapers are the rough draft of history. So these are, working under very difficult conditions, sometimes tight deadlines. We'll get things wrong. It doesn't matter how careful we are. The important thing is correcting those errors as quickly as possible. Now, that seems pretty logical, I guess, especially when you consider that the Trust Project, which is a US-based organization that has news organization members around the world, has talked to a number of readers of news, both those who very much trust and are engaged with news and those who are resistant and disengaged, to ask them, what is it that helps you trust a news source? And corrections rank very highly. They want to see that news organizations are transparent when they make a mistake, that they are clear about what was wrong and what the correct information is. And yet, sometimes journalists themselves will resist the process because they think it somehow might taint the trust in their work or the hard work that they've done. If there's a note at the top that says includes correction, as it does on the Globe and Mail site, there's a note at the bottom that explains what the error was. But it's important because, from a practical perspective, people will be referring to this document for years and years. So back when, all of us on the panel started as journalists, probably we were using microfilm or microfiche. And once the print edition was gone, really the public was not necessarily very often looking back to it. Now, if the public wants to find out information about a topic, they'll plug it into a search engine, and any story we've published might come up. So it behooves the public for us to make sure that we've corrected our copy. And if we've corrected it, we need to say what was changed. What did we get wrong and when was it changed? So that we are staying to our commitment of chronicling history as it happens, and also chronicling our process of covering it. And I could talk about this for days, but really suffice it to say that it's baked into many editorial codes of conduct that correction should happen as quickly as possible and on every platform where an error was published. So that would be print, website. If it was published in a news alert, another news alert should go out correcting the error. Social media as well, third-party platforms like Apple News. So it also helps to fight disinformation and misinformation, which is such a big concern. Not to get ahead of ourselves here, but it's having a source of trustworthy information and acknowledging that we will get things wrong, but correcting it as soon as possible.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. Jack, what would you like the public to better understand?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about an area of misunderstanding, which is assumptions that a lot of people make about the meaning of the story selection and story framing of the media they consume. So let me explain what I mean by story framing. Journalists, they have to be concise because there's always limits on how long their articles can be or time constraints for radio and television. So a big part of their process is trying to find the focus of their report. Like, what frame are they going to use to assess whatever it is that they're covering? So sometimes that's really easy. A tornado hits a house where you live and what the first story is, right? Were people harmed, how much damage there was, etc. But when you go to do a follow-up story, choosing your focus is a little more challenging. Maybe it's about problems with the way that homes are being built, or maybe it's about the systems in place to warn people that a twister is coming. Or maybe it's broader about climate change and the possibility that tornadoes are going to hit us more often. So any of those can be a valid story, but chances are that a reporter is not going to be able to cover all of them in the time that they're given. So they pick one focus. So if they tell a story about construction materials, it doesn't mean that they're ignoring or denying climate change. And sometimes people, I find, complain to me that, why did you do this story but not that? So the same forces are at play for reporters covering politics or even an overseas war. People tend to believe that the way a particular story is framed reflects an agenda by the journalist or the newspaper or the network. And of course, that's possible. That's not impossible, but most of the time the rationales are just so much more mundane. It's usually about logistics. Which story do you have time to put together to meet your deadline, or which people are available to be interviewed? Maybe you just want to take a different look at the issue than you did the day before. Or if it's for a TV newscast like The National on CBC, they're not just trying to cover the news, they're trying to make a program that people will actually watch. So they're asking themselves if their content reflects the experience of people all around the country. Are they covering a range of issues from politics to technology to culture? Is there enough variety in tone? Because, if every story is depressing in an hour-long program, people are just going to click, right, and change the channel. So there's a lot more that goes into story selection and story framing by journalists than many people in the public usually consider. And most of the time, it has very little to do with agendas being set by the media.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Elisabeth, from across the pond, what concerns you about the readers that you deal with? You're a global readers editor, so you must be getting a lot.
I am, but some things that come up, common to all readers, and I've allowed myself a headline on my misconception, which is reporters don't write headlines. And what I mean by that is not all about headlines, but what I mean by that is that the person whose byline, whose name is on the story, is most unlikely to have written the headline, chosen the picture, written the picture captions, or any other part of what you see on the page, because bringing news to publication is a collective responsibility, it's collaborative, it'll involve a commissioning editor, desk editor, sub-editors, we call them, I don't know if it's the same term, copy editors, maybe a more familiar term, picture editors, a lawyer if relevant, possibly a senior editor, and headlines are usually written by copy editors. It's considered a specialist skill, sometimes revised by a desk editor, and usually these days also an audience team in larger news organizations will also advise on how to make the headline most effective for the digital world, because it's got to work for search, but it's also got to work at an individual level and speak to the reader. And so I feel for reporters, I think, and commentators, because their names are to the fore. They're the one name that's associated with a particular article. They've researched and they've written it, and they can really be taken to task on social media, and sometimes in the complaints that I see coming to me directly, if there's been a headline or other part of, we call it page furniture, that is inaccurate or considered inappropriate. Don't you know this stuff? Or even your own article contradicts what's in the headline you've written. On one occasion, there was a bad case of mistaken identity with a picture, and the Guardian actually put out a statement to explain that the person whose name was on the article had not chosen the picture because they were coming under such pressure over it. So yeah, once the copy that the story has been filed by the reporter, the rest is pretty much out of their hands. Obviously, if it's a complex or specialist or sensitive story, then there might be queries go back and forth in the editing process. And I say reporters don't write headlines, not just to knock headline writers either. I was a sub-editor and have written headlines. I know that most mistakes are caused by speed, a lapse of concentration, perhaps a misunderstanding of the text, which actually may reveal a lack of clarity in the article. In short, accidents do happen. But so I just share this in case it's useful. I think it is useful if you're wanting to engage with a news organization. Sometimes I feel frustrated on behalf of the reader or the individual or company or organization, because they've perhaps been trying to reach a writer whose name's on it to seek an amendment, and that person may not be reachable. And in fact, I don't know how it is in other newsrooms, but I would say most newsrooms, reporters don't have access or authority to go in and change something on the page. So I would say knowing what the system is for seeking corrections, clarifications at the broadcaster or news organization or newspaper, and coming straight to them to raise a concern is really helpful to everyone, because nobody wants to get it wrong. And I don't see anyone coming to work wanting to get something wrong. And the sooner things can be fixed, the better, if there has been an error. So, yeah.
That's a really good basis. Donovan, what concerns you about what the public doesn't know? You're unmuted.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Yes. A concern that I hear raised a lot from readers, or that I see raised a lot from readers, is it pertains to online commenting under articles and feature stories. You're smiling, I see, Kathy. It's been an ongoing issue for many, many years. Right now, there are certain topics that we close reader commenting on, because they basically violate community standards. We hear a lot of readers who say, well, why can't I comment on this? I see that the commenting portion under this online article is closed. It's violating my charter rights. I've actually heard that argument. It violates my charter rights, my rights. What's going on? Why can't I comment? Why can't I, say something? And so what I had to do was I wrote an article, a column a few months back, sort of explaining that on certain topics, immigration, poverty, there's certain issues, foreign files, foreign stories, where we find the commenting tends to get very vulgar, unfortunately, racist, homophobic, sexist commentary, just really unpleasant remarks that create an unsafe space. What we at the Star we're trying to do is create, as I said, a safe space where people can comment respectfully with one another. What was happening in the past, we have had different types of reader commenting systems, but we were finding that people it just became a free-for-all, a gong show, as one of my colleagues called it. And so we've tried different systems. We had sort of people, actual individuals who, they were given a manual, these are specific standards we have, and they would look at articles, and then that didn't work. We now have a sort of a moderated system where it picks up certain words that are offensive, when comments kind of go off topic, anything that's really creates an unpleasant environment for commenting and for conversation. Sometimes it's not just people wanting to comment, they want to see what people are saying and kind of get a sense of, the story behind the story. And that can be useful. But what we've found from our readers, for every complaint where someone says, why can't I comment here, we get many, many more people who are saying, this is an offensive remark that's on your under this article. What's happening here? We find that we have a lot of readers who expect civil engagement, civil back and forth, and we have to be cognizant of that. We can't just, there are websites and social media platforms where people can just go on and they can swear and they can make all kinds of comments and just do anything. It's kind of, I've just described it as sort of a Wild West forums for reader engagement, but that's not what the Star is about. And some people say, oh, well, you're censoring and you're being woke and politically correct and all of those kinds of things. And you know what? Maybe there is some truth to those criticisms, but at the end of the day, we look at what the majority of our readers are telling us, and they have spoken and we have listened, and what they're saying is they want civil discourse when it comes to commenting on our articles. So that's an area I would say that I get a lot of some misunderstandings about.
That's great. Thanks, Donovan. This is a question for all of you, and please answer as you wish. Do you think this role, and it's very unique in journalism, not every news organization has it, can this role help create greater public understanding of journalism? And if so, how do you personally do that? And like, what aspects of this role facilitate that public understanding that is really what media literacy is all about? When we talk about media literacy, what we're meaning is people understanding what goes into trustworthy news. So your role, and what do you do?
I'll jump in if I might.
Sure.
As the newbie, I think I'm the newest standards editor in the group. I think just having being the person, the point person that readers can reach out to when they have a question, when they have a complaint, and them being surprised and delighted that somebody's actually responded. And it's an opportunity to communicate, some of the things that we've talked about today. Here's what went into that story. Here's what goes into our journalism in general. Here's the framework that commenting happens in. Okay, so your comment actually was fine, but it was picked up by a word filter and held for moderation, and that's why it wasn't published immediately. It's an opportunity to provide information and learning, and in the best cases, develop a rapport with your longtime subscribers who can come back to you over and over again with ideas and ways to improve things.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. We'll just keep going in the same order.
Yeah, let's do that.
So the way it works at CBC is a little bit different as in an ombudsman role. And so people will file complaints to my office that there's something that they didn't like about CBC journalism. And if it merits a response, I don't just leap into action myself. I actually go to the people who were responsible for the content. So it could be an editor or the producer of a program, and get them to actually respond directly to the complainant. And that kind of accountability and engagement is actually a remarkable thing. And I get really excited when CBC comes back to someone and says, you're right, you made a good point. We're going to alter our copy, or we're going to do something. That's phenomenal, right? Like that kind of that can only help build trust. And then there are times where people will get the response from CBC and they'll still say, yeah, I'm not buying that. And they have a chance to come back to me and say, okay, Jack, can you do a review? And I'll do an investigation and actually publish a report in public that people can read on my website that says CBC violated their journalistic standards, or CBC adhered to the journalistic standards. And I can make recommendations of things that they can do to do better journalism in the future. And this is not a perfect solution to all of the problems and the PR problems that journalism has, but it sends a signal to the audience and to readers and to listeners and viewers that the organization actually cares. And I think more news organizations would really benefit from having the kinds of roles that ours do, because it forces people to actually think about what the audience wants and needs.
Elisabeth?
I would endorse Sandra and Jack's comments wholeheartedly. The Guardian has had a readers editor since 1997. If you think back to those days, there were very few ways for readers to interact with the newspaper, through the letters page perhaps, or writing an angry letter to the editor. Since then, there's many. The way we can consume news, I mean, like that expression, but digital news has leveled, much more leveled the relationship between news organizations and their readers and audiences. But there is still a great appetite for readers to get in touch with readers editor, public editor, to have that conversation. And I think that listening has always been an underrated quality. Oh, excuse me, my light. Has always been an underrated quality in journalism, and I think it's just ever more important in the news environment now, and set against a backdrop of a lack of trust and misinformation. And I think to be in this position, to be able to listen and then to amplify that back into the newsroom, but also explain, not just be here to correct, but if you've got the time to explain to readers who have got in touch why something went wrong or what your considerations were. And I see that it is so rewarding when you have the chance to do that. And some of us have columns through which we can do that, or newsletters. And I think listening, explaining, amplifying just never go out of fashion, but have never been more necessary than they are now. And trust, building trust, regaining trust, it's everyone's business, isn't it? From everybody in the newsroom to do that through the way they can conduct their news gathering, by the way they report, by just the way they connect with their readers and the communities they're writing about. But accountability is also really important in the listening, and I think that's where our roles have a really big role to play.
Donovan.
Yeah, I think
vital is that
that
role?
yeah, I think that the public editor role is also important in terms of the financial considerations. I mean, right now we are in a very, very competitive marketplace in terms of the media. I remember there was a time before the internet came where the Star, the Globe, the Sun, and later the National Post were kind of the only game in town, and it was a lot, lots of money coming into all of those publications, and we kind of had the massive share of the market. Well, now we have all this competition on the internet, and people can, readers can pick and choose where they want to gather their news. They don't necessarily want to be just Star readers or just be Globe readers, or listen, to the CBC or Guardian, et cetera, et cetera. And so the role of the ombudsman or public editor is, when you're creating those relationships with your readers, as you guys have all talked about, it also does create a situation where they want to go back to the Star or the Globe or the CBC or what have you, and they feel that, wow, this is a good quality publication. When they make mistakes, they fix those errors so that when I'm reading something, if there is a mistake, it's going to be addressed. There is that quality control. And that is a big area when it comes to marketability and making your publication relevant and maintaining that relevance. So I see that, and it's a role I didn't necessarily see. See, I was a reporter for many, many years beforehand, and all I cared about was my news story and being on the front page or getting on the front of the website and just thinking about what the story itself and what it did for me, and that's it, kind of go home. Where now I'm on the side of the other side, the management side, where oversight side, where I do see that there's a existential aspect to that we need to maintain that relevance, and a big part of doing that is making sure, as you said, Sandra, when there's something to be fixed, fix it right away, being transparent about it, showing when it was fixed, what was changed, taking the reader kind of through that journey, so that, when, you think about a conversation where a group of people saw an article in the Star, and one person saw it at a certain point and they say, oh, wait a second, I read this. And then another person says, well, I read that. And you can go back to the article and say, oh, article was altered, and these were the things that were changed about the story. And it maintains that trust, that sort of credibility, and again, the marketability of the product. I mean,
yeah, good point. When I was in the role, I used to describe my job as explaining journalism to the public, but also the concerns of the public to the newsroom. I wonder, how open do you believe your newsrooms, or newsrooms in general, journalists in general, are to that public input, whether that's criticism, concerns? Rasmus Kleis Nielsen last month wrote from the Reuters Institute at Oxford that renewing the social contract between journalism and the public will take more than insisting that news is great as it is. He suggested a question journalists could pose to the public it relies on is, what can we do for you? How open are newsrooms to that back and forth with the public, to listening to the public? Should
we go in the same order?
Sure.
I mean, I'll go back to what Jack was saying about, the function of the basic function of what we do is, it's not that as standards editors or ombuds people or readers editors or public editors, we're sitting on our throne and decreeing things. We have to collaborate with the newsroom in order to find out, did we actually make a mistake? Because sometimes a reader will say, I think this is an error, and it's our job to fact check and work with the reporters who are the subject matter experts to figure out, was there an error made? What's the best way to fix it, especially if we're rewording some of the copy online and communicating out what we did. So there needs to be a buy-in. This whole process doesn't work unless there's openness in the newsroom to hearing that feedback. And when it comes to story ideas, I mean, that's always, on merit, as our editor-in-chief likes to say. But there is often willingness to, oh, okay, actually, I see what you said about that story. I'll forward on suggestions that readers give, as well as communicate about corrections. So I think the answer is that there is a great deal of willingness.
Yeah, so sometimes people forget that journalists are actually human beings. Shocking, I know. And as a result, there tend to be two extremes, I find. There are the people who, when told by someone in the audience that they have made an error, will defend their work until their very last breath. And then there are the people who will instantly cave and apologize, as, you know, even if there was no merit to the complaint at the beginning. And one of the virtues of having this kind of a process, or whatever process your organization has, if it's, you know, people being able to submit errors and suggested corrections online, it just professionalizes the conversation to remind everybody that our objective is not to be, you know, to show that we have superior knowledge or to instantly bend over for any win that someone in the public has. It's to get stuff right. That's our job. And obviously we want to get it right at the beginning. But if someone tells us there's reason why we aren't as right as we think we are, well, then you've got to think about it and act upon it. And, you know, as everybody else has already said, the demonstration of integrity and intent when you actually make corrections is a very powerful thing. And one of the added virtues beyond the marketability and beyond it showing you're accountable is that on those times where you come under attack and you stand by your reporting, people are more likely to believe you when that happens because you've shown that you're willing to change and acknowledge mistakes previously.
Well said.
Yeah, go ahead, Elisabeth.
Thank you. Yes, speaking from obviously my own experience at The Guardian, as Jack has said, well, actually, nobody really enjoys being criticised in their work, and it can often feel quite public if your work is journalism. So, of course, some journalists are more receptive to it than others. But I have found really very little difficulty in relaying concerns to journalists and readers. In fact, The Guardian's not behind a paywall, so we get a huge amount of contact from readers every day, and we can't undertake to enter into one-to-one correspondence with everybody who gets in touch. But what we do is we read everything and we forward quite a bit of feedback. And I will sometimes say to an editor that I'm sending on to, just sending this for your consideration for feedback. You don't have to reply if you don't wish. But I'm also amazed how often they do say, actually, I'd really like to explain this to the reader, or can you just thank them because we hadn't seen it that way, and that's been really useful, or perhaps it leads to a story idea. So I think it is welcomed. It's an extension of the news process. It's being sort of willing to look in the rearview mirror, if you like, and not just think that the job is done once you have filed. And I've tried to find other ways as time allows to either collate feedback on a single topic for editors. I do it in a rather I don't have a set way. I know some public editors will hold perhaps weekly meetings or do internal newsletters, but I will collate feedback on a theme or send a message to all staff with these are some of the things that have been concerning readers lately. And the feedback I get on those is really positive. So from those indicators, I think it is appreciated. Oh, and I was on the journalist to human. The other thing is that it's really nice to be able to share thoughts, criticisms, and even sort of robust criticism. But it's always easier to forward something to a reporter, a columnist, an editor, if it's in respectful terms, because often people are angry they write in robust terms, but it makes it sometimes more difficult to share when your so-called journalist and continues to take them apart in other ways because they're angry. Because we know once we get back to that reader and you know, and explain that it often diffuses things massively.
Donovan, how open is the newsroom to listening?
I like to think that more open since I've gotten in, but I mean, that's not necessarily realistic. But I know when I first started the job, I did receive a, not fair degree, but certain level of pushback when there was a reader complaint, when there was a mistake in an article or column or whatnot, and I raised it with the writer. And I think what I try to do is a couple of things. A former senior editor told me something that sort of always sort of sits with me. She said, actually, you never want to lose the room. And I always sort of think about that in terms of my approach. So you don't want to come in hot and doing any finger pointing, certainly no humiliation, certainly a gentle approach. And in that line of thinking, I also go back to the time when I was a reporter, which was many years at the Star. And when I made a mistake, all the different levels of emotion you go through, you're angry, you're embarrassed, you're frustrated, all of those things. I always sort of tap into that feeling that I had whenever I made a mistake when I'm approaching a reporter. And so I'm not, ever trying to do any finger pointing or it's not about laying blame. It's, look, we've got a problem here. This is what the reader says. And as I think someone earlier, Jack, I think you said, or Kathy, they're not always right. Sometimes the complaint has no merit. Actually, sorry, that was Sandra. But you do your fact checking. But then once you've determined, yes, there's something wrong here, it's all about sort of that journey together kind of thing, where you're saying, okay, look, let's fix this. How do we fix it? What's the best way? What's the best wording for the correction? And just sort of take it that way. And my whole approach is, again, look, we're not looking back. We're going to fix this and we're going to move on. And today is a new day, or tomorrow's a new day, or whatever. And we're not keeping, we're not holding a grudge. We're not doing anything like that. I think that was a thing that I had to learn, is not to get my back up or to be too aggressive in terms of when I'm trying to problem solve, but trying to just really keep my eye on what's best here. What is the best solution? And sometimes checking myself as well, that maybe I don't quite understand what's happening or the wording or whatever is wrong, and sort of just go through that whole process. So it's a lot of different sort of steps to get that buy-in in the newsroom, to answer your question, Kathy, to sort of get folks to be on the same page with me, that it's not, we're just trying to make things better. And it's about, again, the survival of the Star and continuing to be relevant and all of those important higher values.
Okay. Well, in the spirit of being better listeners of our audiences, I'd like to move us a little earlier into audience questions than we normally would, because we've got some really great questions. A lot of them follow some themes that probably won't surprise you. There are a lot of questions around bias. I'm going to go with a question from someone named Paul, who says, many people have broader trust problems than corrections, headlines, and so on. They think that over time, news media show biases over framing and worldviews and are unfair or politically charged. Or they criticize approaches such as both sidisms, pack reporting. A lot of questions around this idea of bias. Someone else asked, how do you help audiences to check their bias? So on both sides, I think that this might be an opportunity to talk about, first of all, bias is a topic we could do a whole session on, but talk about the standards of your news organization that guide you on these questions of bias, conflict, disclosure. Sandra, do you want to start us off?
Sure. The topic of balance is something that I get asked about a lot. And it's trickier to curate than it was in the days when we had a print publication, and that was it. You could create a package and there would be perhaps 3 or 4 articles in a package that together offered the balance that your newsroom has curated. Whereas now a lot of audience members will come to a story not by visiting your website or opening the newspaper, but because they've signed up for newsletters or from a third party or social media website. So they might be seeing one story out of the context of the intended balance, and that makes it really challenging to convey. At the same time, it's not practical or possible to cram all of balance into every single story, especially because we know audiences prefer, generally speaking, shorter articles. And if we're doing an ongoing news story, not every story can be 2,000 words. So I've raised a problem without an answer, and I don't know that anyone has the answer to that yet. The way that news is consumed makes it additionally challenging. And then one other piece about bias. There is evidence that, not speaking about the news organizations represented here, but there is growing partisanship in news organizations, and audiences are picking up on that. Now, there are some audience members who gravitate towards that. They want their beliefs confirmed by their news organization. So what we're missing out on is the practice of consulting multiple organizations to get a sense of what are the facts and how will I make up my own mind around that. I will often remind readers that that's best practice if they write to me and they have questions about partisanship or bias. But there are increasing challenges. So I'm going to leave it there, where I've raised a couple of issues without answers, and maybe other people have answers.
Nice try, Sam. Nice try. So I actually want to go back a little bit to the question you posed earlier about what can news organizations do for the public. And one of the things we can do, because everything that Sandra just described is a real phenomenon, is we all need to do a better job of helping the public understand why we feel we can justify our coverage as being balanced or fair. So we need to, if we're going to have short stories or, have narrowly focused things that are just a sliver of a much bigger complex issue, we need to give people the tools to say, okay, you can find this other story here, or we acknowledge that somehow in your presentation that this is not meant to reflect the entirety of the issue at hand. And I think as an industry, we need to be more creative and spend some time figuring out how we can do that. Because right now, the questioner, was it Paul, I think?
Yes.
Paul was bang on that different news outlets feel like they have a certain bias in a certain direction. That may or may not actually be a terrible thing. I mean, advocacy journalism has a long and noble history. At CBC as the public broadcaster, that's not what we do. We really do need to kind of reflect the experiences of Canadians from all different vantage points. But it would just be really helpful for media organizations to give their audience and their readers more tools to assess the work that we do, and just more transparency around what we do. And I think that would be a start.
Do your readers understand, and this is a affiliate question for all of you, do your readers understand that you have journalistic standards, that you make your judgment calls are based on journalistic standards, that have evolved, and that everyone in the organization is involved in creating them, and that they are based on ethical, the principles of ethical journalism? Do your readers know that?
I think many of them do, but some express that they don't believe that we're following them.
Okay. Sandra? I'm sorry, Elisabeth.
On that point, I certainly see a fair few emails from readers in which they will cite parts of the editorial code. Sorry about that. They will cite parts of the editorial code. The Guardian's editorial code is a public-facing document, and it's linked to from the page about the Guardian reader's editor. But I don't think that everyone would necessarily be aware of it. I mean, in that context, on the question of bias, the first clause of and it's in fact very similar to the industry code in the UK, that it says, while free to editorialize and campaign, a publication must distinguish clearly between comment, conjecture, and fact. And That doesn't always mean having a label saying opinion on the top or comment, tone of the headline and the first paragraph. If it begins with an I, you would know this was a first person, this was a voiced piece. But I certainly think in a digital age, that anything extra that you can do to help readers know before they engage, at the moment of engagement, whether they are reading comment, analysis, which falls somewhere between the two, and news reporting, is helpful, because I do see complaints from readers about opinion pieces saying the person has, the writer has not been impartial in their view. And of course, opinion is there for a person to express their personal feelings on the issue of the day. So I think distinguishing comment from news is really important. We did some work on that a couple of years ago in response to feedback that I noticed from the feedback that I was getting was that analysis was causing confusion, because it would perhaps be written by a specialist correspondent, but wouldn't be would have quite a bit of what was perceived as voice in it. It wasn't comment, but it wasn't straight news either. So we did some presentational work on that to make that much more apparent to readers. I think when it comes to news reporting, again, our guidelines say that journalists working in news should always strive to be fair and objective in their reporting, and to recognise how their natural personal biases could affect that. So that's about sort of rigour and methods that ought to be brought to bear in the news gathering. And then when it comes to what's on the page, I think to be open about saying what we know, but also what we don't know. What might the reader ask when they get to the end of the story that hasn't been answered, and if it can't be answered, to perhaps say that, and to say what we know and what we don't know, but also to explain how we know what we know as best we can. Of course, there are confidential sources and journalism 101 that you must respect a confidential source, but where we can, I think it's all the more important now, because most news organizations maintain a record of their publishing in permanently, so people may be going back in the long tail weeks or months or years afterwards, and stories can recirculate again. But even in the moment, I think to show how you knew something, just that they're all ways of, I think, building and cementing trust with readers.
Yeah, I think just to echo what Elisabeth was saying about the labeling, I know the situation that popped up a few months back, where it was a newsletter item that there was a bulletin and it was thrown to a newsletter item, but it said breaking news was the label, but then it was actually an opinion piece on a news event. And a reader, very sharp-eyed reader, said, well, wait a second, what's going on? I opened this piece that came across, and it said breaking news, but then it was someone's opinion. And we actually did have a conversation, my office and the editors involved, and we actually ended up putting an opinion label on this breaking news item, or this opinion item. So we have to be really careful about those kinds of instances. Elisabeth also talked about that nuance, that difference between analysis and opinion. And analysis is, yes, experts, someone's a reporter or whoever having expertise or explaining sort of the context of something, and it's explanatory, but then that can kind of trip into a little bit into opinion. So we do have to be really super careful about labeling opinion versus analysis. And again, that's an issue that has popped up a lot from my office. And then the other thing is, and to Jack's earlier point about pointing folks to what we have, and Sandra touched about this as well, the totality of what we're presenting on a specific issue. And I think that, using things like hyperlinks really carefully and embedding stories. Like we'll have breakers in our online stories, and you'll see, we'll see this aspect of the story and see this aspect and this aspect, so that our readers can see that it isn't just this one article that is, you know, touching on this much broader issue. And then I think the other thing is that I certainly do this with senior editors when we're getting feedback about bias and a headline maybe isn't quite accurate. I'll give you an example. The other day, we had this bike lanes are a big issue in Toronto, and there was a meeting in Etobicoke, and it said residents versus cyclists, or residents square off against cyclists over bike lanes. And we had a couple of cyclists kind of write in and say, well, what's going on here? We are residents, and why are you describing us as just cyclists? We actually live in this community. Like, it's not, we're residents as well. And we had some, you know, thought about this, and we actually did go in and tweak the headline to something more like, you know, bike lane issue causes uproar in community, Etobicoke community, whatever. But I thought, yeah, that's a really good point, you know, and how we're looking at different issues, and there was maybe a bias there. Maybe that, I don't know, the headline writer maybe had a view of, well, those cyclists are, you know, over there, and us residents, you know what I mean. So you really have to be careful in terms of how what I mean. At the end of the day, you know, I remember being in J school, and we're supposed to be unbiased and we're supposed to be neutral, and that's really kind of not possible. Let's just be completely honest. We all bring our experiences and our points of view and our biases and our perspectives to everything we see in the world. And so, yes, to that reader, you know, there is an issue with bias that we always have to kind of grapple with. But I think that we have to take those kinds of criticisms when we get them and do a gut check and think, oh, are we giving a bit too much of our point of view on this, and are we being fair, and are we being neutral? Now, that's nothing to do with opinion pieces, which obviously, if it's an opinion, if it's an op-ed or a opinion column or anything like that, an editorial, that's different, where yes, some biases are coming in, especially with opinion columnists. They have a wide latitude to express their point of view. And, you know, I've, you know, walked our readers through that a lot, because a lot of folks don't quite get that opinion columnists have a wide latitude. So it's, you know, just trying to explain things to people, but also doing those gut checks internally, I think.
Okay, I want to get to a question from someone named Greg, and then it's sort of amplified by Brody. The question is, how do journalists and newsrooms deal with politicians who are screaming fake news and blaming the media, when what you're seeking to do is seek truth, report truth? And, you know, that goes right down to politicians who are seeking to politicize corrections even, and use them as evidence of failure of the media. And Brody tells us that the corrections disclosure that CBC News maintains has been used to attack the organization as proof of failure. So we're talking about being responsive to public, but public is a very, very broad term, and part of the public is this politicization of I don't know if it's too strong to say media hate, but blame the media. What do we do? What do you do about that?
I mean, I've received emails on the weekend from government offices asking for corrections or demanding corrections, and have lots of back and forths to determine, no, we weren't wrong, and have follow-ups from that office saying, but you need to do this. No, you need to do this. It's quite aggressive, or it can be. We also are seeing politicians in leveraging televised news or scrums to besmirch the media's name, let's say. And, really, I think this is a place where public editors and ombudspeople can, again, with education, with talking to readers, if you have the space in a column, to talk about it, because otherwise readers are experiencing this in a vacuum in their homes or on their mobile phones, and they don't have the other side of the story. So, we talked about balance earlier. we have an opportunity through communicating with our audience members to share, okay, so you saw this on your news broadcast. Here's what happened on the other side. Here are some things for you to think about. Again, giving audience members the tools and information to make up their own minds. It's not a matter of saying, well, that's really not true, you just need to believe us. It's providing the material, the information that can allow our audiences to do that.
Yeah, I think for all of us on the panel and the positions that we're in, we're able to engage with some of these things in a dispassionate way. Because a lot of the problems that get created, especially in perceptions to the public, is when it feels very emotional. It's like, oh, you made that mistake. You're doing this for your narrative reasons, blah, 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 blah. And to be able to say, okay, let's actually just look at the facts and treat it in a professional manner, and keep things in perspective and in proportion. And I think as far as corrections and people leveraging that against media organizations, you kind of have to play the long game. I mean, there's no short-term advantage in saying we goofed. It's a long-term play. It's in saying, like, no, we're always going to be transparent when we make a mistake, and we're going to fix it, and we're going to be acknowledge it. And so, if a politician is going to try and and use that against you, to some extent, you got to be a little bit stoic. I think, unless they are then lying and misleading people about the nature of the error or the reason why the error happened. And then, you can report what actually happened and just be truthful and honest about it. But to start inserting ourselves as an antagonist of any political figure is generally not a happy way for us to go.
Good point. Is the situation similar in Britain, Elisabeth?
Yeah, I absolutely recognise what Jack and Sandra have said, and also on Jack's last point, I do think that, yes, there is concern. I mean, not necessarily from politicians, but by any individual organisation, company, perhaps, or politician seeking a correction, that they may use it in leverage it in some way. But I really think you just have to look at, as Jack said, dispassionately. Was there a misstep here? Was there a big mistake here? Is a correction merited? And really play the ball and not the player. And I think if you're not open and approachable to considering somebody's concern, who's particularly when they're directly affected by the article or the content in question, then it's probably going to play worse if you don't give that a fair hearing, whichever outcome you arrive at in the end. So yes, I do try to just get to the heart of the matter. And I don't know if the question was also looking at how journalists handle those who may be giving incorrect information, or but I think that's a very lively debate about that. But personally, I've always been of the view that having somebody on the record, whether they've misspoken just in error or intentionally, having them on the record means they can be challenged on it, held to account. If you've sought that right to reply in advance, it's part of your fact checking, and therefore you can go back if the response that you have got from a person or organisation doesn't feel, or it not to be right. So I think that if newspapers are able to do that, but decline to do that, then it doesn't mean the voice or the misinformation will disappear. It'll reappear or persist somewhere else without challenge. So
okay. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap this up, and that before we even get to probably half the questions. What I would like to do, though, is thank each and every one of you for your time, for your expertise. You are all a credit to your news organizations, and big credit to your news organizations for maintaining this position, for committing to it. It's not easy to field criticism, to listen to a public, to anyone who will call you fake news or enemies of the people, which we've also seen here in Canada. But the work you do to show that journalists are human, that journalists care, that journalists are invested in trustworthy information, that what we do is verify facts and tell you when the difference between news and opinion. So you are the front lines of connection to the public in this, which means you're the front lines of creating the news literacy that a democracy demands. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Really appreciate you being here with us.